presentation that I had specifically for y'all did not save here on the computer, so bear with me. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is actually going to be spoken instead of you seeing it on the PowerPoint up here. There are several myths with wildlife rehab when you're doing this work. There are several myths that I'll go over here with you. Anybody who finds an injured or orphaned wild animal can take it home and care for it, and everything will be wonderful. That's an absolute myth. These animals require specialized diets that are specific to that particular species. So it's not like you can just go out to the store and buy a bag of dog food or cat food for these animals. You have to order supplies in and keep them on hand. Well, ordering supplies takes money. That's myth number 2. You're not going to make any money doing wildlife rehab, and you will come out of pocket for most of your expenses. It's very, very rare that a wildlife rehab center is actually completely self-sustaining. Usually they're just right over the next horizon to where they're going to be bankrupt. And I think Nancy will agree with me on that one. Everybody needs funds, and it's very, very difficult to raise funds in wildlife rehab, because once someone brings you an animal to your facility and that initial donation is taken, a lot of times they don't stay as a sustaining donor because they feel like that covers a lot of the rehab care. Well, it could cost $150, $200, $300, $500, $1,000 to rehab some of these animals, depending on how long their term of the care is for the animal when it comes in and how long you have to keep it. If it comes in late in the season and it can't be released, you have to hold that animal until the next season or euthanize it. And a lot of times, Wildlife and Fisheries or the feds are going to require you to euthanize that animal instead of actually holding it until the next season. And you have to make a quality of life choice when you're doing these wildlife rehab work as well. Euthanasia and death are a huge part of wildlife rehabilitation and the daily life of a wildlife rehabber. Most of the animals that you're going to be getting in when you work at these wildlife rehab centers, either as a sub-permittee, working with them, doing intake, or whatever you're doing, unless you're doing education or something where you're dealing with education animals every day, a lot of the animals coming in are extremely sick, and you have to take that animal and make it do a complete 180 and, go right back out the door again, basically. Number 2, or number 3, the third myth is that it's a hobby. This is absolutely not a hobby. This is a profession, and we require that you be a professional wildlife rehabber. You can't just take in a bunch of squirrels, baby squirrels, and then say one day, well, I don't want them anymore. What am I going to do with them? You can't do that, because that squirrel's counting on you to release it out and to properly rehab that animal when it comes in. Again, it requires a special diet, and it takes a lot of time. Some of these animals, some of the songbirds have to be fed as often as every 20 minutes. And that is from sunrise to sunset, sometimes even later. So it is an absolute commitment when you're working with these wild animals. You have to be 100% dedicated, or don't do it, or don't take them in. And Wildlife and Fisheries start screening people a little bit more for that as well. Myth number 4, wildlife rehab is fun. Wildlife rehab is not fun. These animals want to kill you. This is not, these pelicans that we're working with at the Oil Wildlife Center, they want to kill you. They try to attack you every time you come near them. They don't know you're helping them, and they want you to just leave them alone so they can go crawl in a hole and die. Well, one of the reasons that we do wildlife rehab is because we have so much human contact with wildlife that it displaces these animals, injures them, and it's not as a result of natural selection. All right, so for some of you, does anybody know what natural selection is? Somebody want to raise their hand and answer the question, what is natural selection? Anybody? Got to have one taker. Come on up to the front. That's why nobody wants to answer any questions, because they have to come to the front. I'll walk to you. How's that? What is natural selection?
That's the strongest survive.
Absolutely. Strongest survive. So a lot of times in the wild, these animals are going to come into you, and only the strongest survive. So that's why a human found them, and you are their natural prey. So they see you as somebody they want to kill. Myth number 5 or 6, I'm not sure which one I'm on now. The government pays wildlife rehabbers to care for wildlife. The government does absolutely nothing for you, and you have to pay them for a permit. All right? They don't like you. They don't want you. A lot of times, they try and stop you from working here in the state, because as biologists, a lot of wildlife biologists do not agree with the work we do. What's so important with what we do is the endangered and threatened animals that come into us. Like here in Louisiana, you could have a bald eagle come into your facility, which of course you would have to have a federal permit for, which I'll get into shortly. But you could have a bald eagle come into your facility, and then that animal has to be, again, successfully rehabbed and released and not imprinted. Because if that bald eagle imprints on you, it's going to come down and land next to whoever's out here in the parking lot and look at them for food. So you have to make sure these animals don't imprint on you as well. Okay, another myth here. Experience with pets or being good with domestic animals qualifies people to be wildlife rehabbers. Again, I think I've already told you it's 100% different with wildlife. These are not dogs and cats that you're cuddling. These are animals that want to kill you, again, and they don't want anything to do with you. And if you have done your job, that animal is still not going to want anything to do with you and has no emotional attachment to you at all when you release them. They run away from you as fast as they can. And that's your satisfaction, seeing the butt end of that animal rolling down the street, when you release them. Loving wildlife qualifies somebody to be a wildlife rehabber. You have to be able to include your compassion in it, but you also need to have your specialized knowledge, skill, facilities, permits, licenses, and a whole bunch more. You can't just love the wildlife. Again, that is where a lot of the euthanasia and a lot of the death comes in, because you have to be able to make a decision on that animal. If it's not going to survive and it's not going to be a fit for the environment that it's going in, you can't release, an owl that's missing an eye. You cannot release that for the most part, unless you do, well, that's a whole other story. But for the most part, those animals cannot be released. So, let's see what else I need to cover. Wildlife likes to be cuddled and loved. I think I've covered that already. Wildlife rehab is a great activity for children. Let's cover that. If you have kids, your kids cannot have any contact with these wild animals. Very, 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 very minimal contact, because they carry all kinds of diseases. Our first rule when we're releasing these animals is to do no harm. Wildlife undergoing rehab are housed basically in a hospital session and in a situation, and just like human hospitals, you have to prevent disease transmission. And there are a huge amount of diseases that you can get from working with wildlife. Off the top of my head, I can tell you one that comes from a raccoon. It's called Bacillus astris, and it's a roundworm that actually migrates through your body and will eventually make it, if it makes it into your brain, it'll kill you. It'll feed off of your brain.
Visceral larva migrans at that stage.
Yeah, visceral larval migrans. And what that means is they get in your system and they just migrate through your whole body. And you'll see them in your arm, you'll see them in people's eyes. But that's why it's so important for you to minimize your contact with them and make sure you wash your hands and keep everything nice and sanitary.
80% of baby raccoons carry Bacillus astris roundworm.
80%. These are common diseases that you will come across when you work with these animals. Lyme disease. We had a rehabber in Washington, Louisiana, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. She passed away not from Lyme disease, but from another disease. She actually contracted Lyme disease from an animal she had in her facility, and she had to go through a whole bunch of treatments. It's not fun at all. A lot of times, Wildlife and Fisheries and, of course, the Rehab Association strongly suggest that you get pre-exposure rabies vaccinations, which are a series of injections into your body with the rabies vaccination that pre-expose you to it. So when you get bit by one of these mammals, and you will get bit if you deal with them, almost everybody will get bit at one point. We try to minimize that as best as possible, but there's a good chance you're going to get bit. And at that point, you would be, in fear of contracting rabies at that point. So that animal would have to be killed and tested. So it's very important that you get your pre-exposure rabies vaccinations and go through all of that training.
Rabies is 100% fatal once the first symptom appears. So that's why we really stress, if you're interested in wildlife rehab, to talk with your physician about getting pre-exposure rabies shots. Because if you've had your pre-exposure, it will give you immunity even if you don't realize that you may have been exposed. There is an instance of a young girl in the Midwest recently with all the new antiviral drugs and supportive care that did survive the rabies. And we hope that the protocols will be more standard with that as time goes on. She did have quite a lot of neurological deficit with it. So for all intents and purposes, it is necessary to consider pre-exposure rabies shots if you're going to work with mammals.